Well, one thing that really kind of was an eye opener for me was the point that you also, Clara, brought up, which is about this that the dystopia has already happened for many people, and the world has already ended, so to speak, for some peoples and populations.
Um, and I guess we just need to reconnect to that thought that the world we live in right now is not natural anymore, but how can we make it a bit more and really reforest our minds? Not only, plant more trees, but also like change the way we see ourselves as humans in this world.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cody. This is Unlivable Cultures. Unlivable Cultures is a podcast making with and borrowing from anthropology, social theory, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. In this episode, I'm joined by Anton from Operaatio Arktis and Clara from the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. So welcome, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you very
It's
much.
great to be here.
All right, great. And yeah, today, so we're going to talk about geoengineering, their own work in geoengineering and climate intervention advocacy, and especially in relation to climate justice and climate justice around youth and Indigenous people, that kind of thing, and also just wherever else the conversation takes us. So I'll just start with asking you two, I guess we can start with Anton, what kind of got you into the geoengineering or climate intervention advocacy space, and yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit of that story and why you think it's so important.
Thanks, Cody. Yeah, sure. Well, maybe I have to start from the beginning of my so-called activist career. That sounds pretty bad, but anyway. So a bit over 4 years ago, I was still studying at university. I was studying philosophy and religions and cultures in general. But then I kind of bumped into Extinction Rebellion when they were having a street protest, and that was quite of a turning point for me, because I saw some people there who I was familiar with, and then I all of a sudden I saw that they were being carried to police cars. Police were detaining them, and this made me wonder that maybe there is something more serious about climate crisis that I've ever thought about. Well, long story short, I went into Extinction Rebellion organizing. I was full time there for 2 years. I was organizing protests, training people for civil disobedience, stuff like that. And then after 2 years, I started to realize that there is some quite serious things happening in the Earth and climate system. I get to know that there are many changes, many dramatic changes taking place at the moment that might not be preventable anymore with emission reductions. So I was pushing for the sort of like political change in Finland to get emissions down and to sort of make this shift towards more sustainable society, which is the thing I still want to do, and I still think is the most important thing. But what I realized was that our societies have kind of like one could even say agreed to accept a certain level of climate damage when we, for example, aim for 1.5 degrees target or 2 degrees target. And when I realized this, that for example 2 degrees target, one could argue it might be relatively safe for someone in Finland, for example. But 2 degrees is devastating. That's catastrophic for many peoples around the world and many cities and countries. And yeah, and at the moment, I'm quite aware that 2 degrees might already be something that we are not gonna stay below, or we are probably going to overshoot 2 degrees if James Hansen and other climate scientists are correct, and that might happen in the next 15 to 20 years. So all of these just this is a long story, but all of these realizations and make me to ask, is there something, some additional things that might work to slow down climate warming? And then I bumped into climate interventions or geoengineering and got really interested in that. And the more I learned about it, the more I learned that I don't know anything about it. And then I just decided that I have to understand this field better. Yeah, that's the background.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That's great. So maybe it'd be helpful if you could maybe talk about some of the specific geoengineering or climate intervention techniques that Operaatio Arktis is really focused on talking about, and like why you have chosen to focus on those techniques as opposed to some other techniques.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. So typically, geoengineering refers to both carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removal, and also solar radiation modification or management, or solar geoengineering. These are the two main categories. We already know that there's a lot of money going into CDR or carbon dioxide removal research, and it's kind of like a normalized topic already. So we decided to focus more on the sort of sunlight reflection stuff, or SRM, solar radiation management thing. And what we think is now needed is more research to help societies and peoples to better understand what these techniques are about. Now there are basically two main ideas for solar radiation management. The first is marine cloud brightening, which is making clouds above the sea more bright, more reflective. And then there is stratospheric aerosol injection, which is making the stratosphere, which is the upper part of the atmosphere, make that more reflective. And the basic idea in both of these is to just reflect a fraction of the sunlight back into space to cool the Earth. And that comes with uncertainties, probably both benefits and also setbacks or risks, problems.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's a really good introduction, and I appreciated also how you were talking about the like what we in the social sciences might call like the social construction of the 1.5 degree or 2 degree targets, because they are like have a lot of assumptions baked into them, and they're not these magic numbers that say like, oh, everything will be fine if we stay at this. And I recently saw a report, I can't remember where from, but suggesting that we were very, very close already, like last year, to the 1.5 degree mark. So that's, yeah, quite worrying to think about. But yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, actually, this just 2 weeks ago, there was this news came out from the European kind of Met Office, which stated that the last 12 months was 1.6 degrees already.
Yeah, wow.
Above pre-industrial. Well, El Nino is going to fade away eventually, maybe in a couple of months, so we will go under 1.5 degrees for some time.
Yeah.
But the trend is, of course, upwards.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so we could move over to you, Clara, and could you just introduce how you got into climate intervention, geoengineering, and your organization, and what your focus is, I guess, at the organization.
Sure. So like Anton said, going back to the beginning, not to the beginning of my activism career, but to
when were you born, and how did that influence where you are now? I'm kidding.
Well, I was born in Brazil 25 years ago, and that's where it started. But no, definitely, in a way it does, because I think growing up in Brazil, so I'm not based there anymore. I'm currently in Germany, but most of my time I spent there in Brazil, and I just grew up surrounded by stunning nature, and it's a given, you know. You don't even think about it a lot. And I I got to this conclusion that is just a given for us when I was trying to mobilize for Extinction Rebellion and for Fridays for Future, for example, or just like protests for the Amazon when there were insane fires happening there. It was so hard to get people to come to the streets. And one of the thoughts that I have, one of my hypotheses, were maybe that like people don't really see like the climate changing. They're still going to the beach, you know, they're still going to their houses in the mountain and their holidays or whatever. So yeah, anyways, that definitely plays a role into how I got to geoengineering. So I was already working with environmental governance or just sustainable development as a broad topic. So in whatever I did, like either academically or volunteering activities, I was always linking it to the environment in a way, from fashion to arts. And so 5 years ago, I heard of this conference that the Brazilian Academy of Science was hosting called International Symposium on Climate Engineering. And considering I was already in this climate field, I was like, okay, I'll go. And it was something that I had never heard of before. And so I got there, and it really shocked me, just as I know it shocks most people like now in 2024 when they first hear of geoengineering, which is like, how come I've never heard of this before? And that was my reaction 5 years ago. It also shocked me that I was the only like visibly young person in the room, and that wasn't a new thing. I was already used to being in these like international conferences and, you know, being the only young person in the room. But it scared me back then because they were talking about things that were so far off in the future. Um, it was like a different climate conversation, and that really scared me because I was like, I cannot be here alone hearing of all those things. And then straight after that conference, this topic was really on my mind, but I couldn't really engage with it because whenever I tried telling people about geoengineering, it just seemed like it was out of context, because we had so many other priorities to focus on. And it's interesting as well because friends that knew me back then, right now they even say like, oh, I remember you telling me about this thing that you went to this conference and you were like thinking about it at night and things like this. So it really got to me in a way that I didn't even remember. But so 2 years ago, that's when I could finally, in a way, really dive deep into geoengineering. I was part of a program of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, which was an organization that ended its activities last year. And so, yeah, I was exposed to several scientists and academics in the field, activists who were already involved with geoengineering. And then that led me to creating a youth program at DSG, as you said, the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. And what we're trying to do, not only with the youth engagement program, but with DSG as a whole, is really bringing the climate justice discussion into geoengineering and really making this knowledge of these technologies arrive to the communities that need to know about it the most. Because as we know, not only for the climate, but several other pressing topics, the people who will either benefit or struggle the most from a given technology or decision they're almost never part of the discussions, or if they are, it's only right at the end when, if they say no, it won't change anything.
And yeah, maybe then it would be interesting to hear both of you reflect on more about the sort of youth angle of this. I think, like, picking up especially from what you said, Claire, about how you were the only young person in the room and they're discussing things that are happening really far into the future. It's like, it's very clear that climate change is going to affect young people. We're going to have to continually deal with the results over the next 50 years of our lives, whereas a lot of the other people in the room having these conversations probably aren't going to live as long, and so they're not going to experience all of these future effects. So yeah, I'd be interested in hearing some of your reflections about that, and yeah, the importance of involving youth in these conversations. Either of you.
I think if we think of the rights of future generations and how this topic is becoming even more a trend, hopefully in the United Nations system, and even in some national governments that are starting to have special envoys for future generations and positions like this. And if you also think of intergenerational justice, right? That the current and future generations, they should, be able to live a decent life. That's also like the basis of what sustainable development means. I think it makes it obvious that we should also be involving young people in these discussions because, first of all, research is not something that's gonna end anytime soon. Like, we're not gonna have clear and like evidence science that will enable us to make decisions this year or the next year. This is something that will keep happening, and so will the decisions. And it's a process. It's geoengineering is not a static thing because the climate is not static as well. And so when you talk about young people, you're thinking that the people who are like our age right now or even younger, they will also be having this discussion in the next 20 years. And things will have changed. Of course, they won't be having the same conversation, but the sooner they start, the better, because then they won't get to their position, say in 10 years, and have to start from scratch. They've already been hearing about this. And that's been happening for other environmental topics as well. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Basic things like recycling. We start learning about it. At least I did when I was like 7 in school. And
well, I'm from the US, so maybe we're a bit behind on these things, but but yeah,
okay,
exactly.
well,
I know what you mean.
hopefully kids in the US now, they hear about recycling when they're 7. But that's not to say that kids in school, they should be talking already about geoengineering in their curricular and stuff, but at least climate education should be there. And then as you
I
get
think
older,
kids though, I think young kids, they're like, especially when you talk about the space mirrors idea that people have put forward in the geoengineering space, I think 7-year-olds be like, okay, wow, that's actually really cool. That's really interesting. So maybe.
yeah, I just think we have to be really careful with kids,
Yes,
because
definitely.
it just sucks, that they have to think that the future is so bleak, which in a way it is. So I think the longer we let them live their childhood peacefully, the better. But no,
Yeah.
anyways,
Yeah,
if
agreed.
you start with climate education, you're already, like preparing them to have these more serious discussions. But yeah, I guess the point that the youth movement makes of having young people at the table is not only, having young people there sitting down on the table, but it's also about giving them the information and, openly sharing knowledge and giving them opportunities to engage with a topic that they will have to be actively deciding on in the next years. And generations change, right? So the youth of today won't be the youth in the next 5 or 10 years. So I think it's just really a capacity issue that you constantly need to be building the capacity of young people so that they can be making good decisions for the generations that are going to come next. And yeah, that applies to geoengineering as it does to a bunch of other topics that require long-term planning.
Yeah, I agree. I think the point about the fact that like the youth of today, like us, are going to continually have these conversations. It's a lot of resonant because I think especially when people talk about geoengineering, it's something as like, oh, we need more research into this before we can make a decision on it. So and it's also sometimes talked about as maybe more of a like last ditch effort potentially, like if at a certain point we realize, oh, like things have gotten too serious that we need to pull this sort of emergency handbrake. But if in 10 years then there isn't a certain level of understanding about it, then we won't be informed enough to make that decision, because then it's too late to start telling people about it. So yeah, I think that's a really elegant way of putting it. Yeah, Anton, do you have any reflections on this you'd like
Well,
to add?
that's a really good. That's a really good point that you made about having the capacity to understand and make proper decisions before the moment of decision making comes. But also when it comes to these powerful geoengineering methods like the stratospheric aerosols, which would have the potential to cool the earth a lot, of course with side effects. That's something that humanity has no technological capacity to do. And some estimates are that even if the decision to deploy would happen like today or next week, it would take something like 10 to 15 years to actually run the technology on a significant scale. So just pointing
I mean,
out that
basically,
sometimes
it's like simulating a volcano eruption. So like simulating a volcano eruption would take some time, I think, for humans to have the ability to do. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's only the technological side. So think about the geopolitical side, or how you could get governments to cooperate. That's just more years there on the timeline.
Yeah.
So just pointing out that sometimes the idea of geoengineering being this kind of emergency button might not actually be that accurate, because you have to break the glass,
Yeah.
on front of the button. But when you break the glass, there's nothing there at the moment. There's no button there. But okay,
Yeah.
so about the youth point, I think one important point is that when we conduct risk analysis about climate risks, and also about the ways how we could mitigate them. So when we think about the potential damage and then the potential solutions, the risk analysis is different according to where you live. For example, if you live in a very climate vulnerable country, you could be, I could imagine you would be more interested in getting the global emissions down quite a bit sooner than if you live in like a comfortable, nice house in Sweden, for example, because you are in a worse risk. And also, of course, socioeconomic status also is a factor there. But then age is quite a significant player also. So if you're let's say 70 years old, you don't like, this is a kind of like a uncomfortable thing to say, but you don't need to care that much. Of course you can have sentiments about it, and you might be an ethical person and care for your children and grandchildren, but it's something abstract still for you to think about what's going to happen in 40 years. But 40 years for some young person now, that's still their adulthood. So the risk analysis is very different. And when we talk about geoengineering, that's also one significant factor here, because I've seen that there are quite a bit of people who are totally opposing even research on climate interventions or geoengineering, and they have all of the right in the world to do that, of course, because people are allowed to disagree with each other. But at the same time, they are quite typically like professors from universities, like older people. And for me from their position to say we should not even research this thing which could affect the future of the young people in a good or a bad way, we should not even research that. That's patronizing, and for me that's I just don't like it at all. So maybe that's one point why young people should be on board. And actually, just last point, quite interestingly, it has been studied to some extent what people think about climate intervention research. So people who are naive to the topic, they are introduced to the topic as part of the research process, and then their opinions are studied. And there's two studies that are independent from each other with quite big like the group of people who have been researched, and both of these show that people in the global south are a bit more positive about climate intervention research than people in global north. And one factor that they've been speculating on could be the age thing, because global south in general is younger, the populations are younger, and of course they are also more climate vulnerable. But just bringing that, I think that's an interesting finding.
That is super fascinating, and I know there's currently like a EU funded project. I think it's called like related to Horizons Europe or something like that, about public perceptions of geoengineering. So it's really interesting to see what the outcomes of that will be.
Co-create.
And sorry.
Co-create. That's
co-create. That's it. You're right. Exactly. Maybe I think this is a really good jumping off point. I really like that connection you made between young people, like the both age and location as being these two factors that really come into play. Because like it's funny, like here in Iceland, some people say like, oh, climate change, that'll just be good because it'll get warmer here and we'll be able to grow more vegetables and do all these things. And I'm just kind of like, wow, that's one stance to have, I guess, sure. Which I think, doesn't show a lot of maybe empathy, or shows the sort of the abstract nature of the effects of climate change, because it's I mean, although a lot of Icelanders go to like Spain and for a holiday, and it's quite a bit warmer there and during the summer, and they can feel that it's 40 plus degrees or something. It's still otherwise quite abstract in what all of the negative consequences of these things are, whereas people in the global south are already quite a bit being impacted and already familiar with the impacts in a lot of cases. And then also, as you said, youth have to think about how this will really be incorporated into their future. Just bring in the book or the chapter we read for this discussion, and then we can get into really the connections between youth and like global south and indigenous people. But we read the chapter Geoengineering and Indigenous Climate Justice, a conversation with Kyle Pose-White, interviewed by Holly Jean Buck. And this was from the book Has It Come to This? The Promises and Perils of Geoengineering on the Brink. And this was edited by J.P. Sapinski, Holly Jean Buck, and Andreas Malm. And I think, there's a couple of currents that I really appreciated from this chapter, of talking about how indigenous people aren't just one group, which I think also applies to youth, is like youth aren't just one group. So there's going to be a lot of different opinions on geoengineering and climate intervention and what climate justice looks like within these groups. And I think that's just important to frame for this conversation, because we're not trying to necessarily represent the view of youth or the view of Indigenous people and people in the global South on this, but just some perspectives and ideas of what we have as being in this space. So Clara, do you have any thoughts on in your own work? Because I know your group and your own work for the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering focuses a lot on global South and involving them in workshops and things and capacity building. So where do you see the connections maybe between Indigenous climate justice or global South climate justice and climate justice for youth, and especially in relation to geoengineering?
I think connecting to this specific interview between Kyle and Holly, maybe one of the points why I really got interested in this geoengineering discussion, I think interested is not like a strong word. Why I got so passionate about it or worried about it is because it's not about, at least for me, and well, according to their discussion as well, which is why I really like this interview, because it kind of validates a bunch of things that I already had in my mind like 5 years ago, is we shouldn't be talking about geoengineering as a way to preserve the mindsets that we already have, or like preserve the future that we have, and allow the young people of the future to have the same lives that we've led. Because why are we just assuming that this is the life that we should be living,
Yes.
And yeah, but I guess also, again, having grown up in Brazil, that's not a given for everyone. It was just a path that I chose to take, which is to connect myself even more to the hundreds of Indigenous cultures that we have there. For years, I've been trying to understand how we can actually go back. It's not the future that I want is not, that shiny future with, flying cars and all that. I want us to find ways to take a couple of steps back and really reconnect ourselves to what it truly means to be human and to have this connection to nature. And I think this should also be part of the discussion on geoengineering. It's not, are we going to use it or are we not going to use it? I think it's more of, why are we going to use it? And then what do we do afterwards? It's not an end, It's not like, okay, we cooled the planet, that's it. No, a bunch of other things, they need to come together. And that's what Indigenous groups have been saying for hundreds of years. In the case of Latin America, for the past 500 years, for example. And also the point that they mention about science fiction and dystopias and things like this. As said by Kyle White, for Indigenous nations, they are already living in a dystopia, and so the dystopias that we as non-Indigenous people talk about, they're much more catastrophic than what it already is. And I guess we just need to reconnect to that thought that the world we live in right now is not natural anymore, but how can we make it a bit more and really reforest our minds? Not only, plant more trees, but also like change the way we see ourselves as humans in this world. And it might seem a bit like it doesn't make any sense. Like, how would you use technology to go back? But I feel like we've already geoengineered our world in unprecedented ways. I think even 50 years ago, I don't think we knew how the world would look like today. And maybe we have the opportunity now of thinking of the future that we really want and the things that we want to allow ourselves to live again, because we've once lived those things before. And so for me, it's not only about geoengineering. It's much more, you know, it's about systems change and how we can get there.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that point because like the way my environmental organization talks about sort of our approach and the way that we want to change the world is to create a world that's like a better place for everyone and a world that like everybody wants. So it's about like coming together as a society of saying, okay, like what values of, you know, the way things are arranged now do we want to preserve, but also what values, what things, the way we go about things, what do we want to change? Because it's definitely, I think most people would say we're far from a utopia or far from, you know, like actually being satisfied with a lot of things. And whether that's blending things from, the past and from other cultures that have maybe, as you say, more harmony with nature, more in tune with what it means to be human, what it means to be an animal, because we are animals. Um, and if that also includes stuff from the future or stuff that we haven't experimented with. And I think, the way I see it is also geoengineering is possibly just a way of buying us time or giving us the space to come together and have these conversations to actually put these things into practice, because we know that so far just the mitigation reductions or reducing the amount of greenhouse gas we're emitting hasn't been happening fast enough to actually slow down and have this conversation about what we're doing. It's like priority number one, reducing greenhouse gases. But that doesn't let us have these conversations either about how we want to transform society along the way too. So I really thought, we really appreciate that point.
And I think we can use the word utopia more often as well. We shouldn't be afraid of utopias. I think for some people it's even more frightening to talk about utopias than dystopias. Maybe we're just hardwired to think of all the worst that can happen. And honestly, for the past weeks, I've been struggling a lot to differentiate what's fiction and what's real life, because I think all the news and everything that's been happening, it's all bleak now, you know. And I hope we can get past that and really imagine things that are good for everyone, like you said, and achieve those things. But then, I know this might be too much of, you know, a fairy tale world, but we can dream, I guess.
Well, one thing that really kind of was an eye opener for me was the point that you also, Clara, brought up, which is about this that the dystopia has already happened for many people, and the world has already ended, so to speak, for some peoples and populations. And that's kind of like that was really a clarifying thing for me to read and think about, because I had a discussion with one indigenous person last autumn in Iceland, actually, and the person was part of Indigenous environmental network, and they are doing great stuff, and we were bonding about a lot of things, and they are pointing out the problems with many of the geoengineering projects, like carbon capture projects, which are completely implausible, like impossible to implement on a significant scale. But they are also opposed to solar geoengineering research, and that's one point where our thinking, like we disagree on that point. But the person told me about the traumatic experiences that their community has had with technology and US government. And for example, that the military has been testing some kind of biological or chemical weapons very next to their home areas in Alaska, and the thing that the military wanted to test was that would this cause cancer for people, and it did cause cancer, and many people died of cancer there. So it's not enough that the areas have been colonized by European peoples like 100 years earlier, but this stuff happened in last century, so something like, I don't know, 70 years ago. And these kind of experiences help me to understand why some people are so not just skeptical, but like just
Opposed
against
or
even research,
resistant.
opposed.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I really appreciate hearing these stories, because it helps me to understand the situation better. That's my reflection on that thing. But I want to comment on the utopia thing also, because I think that some kind of positive narrative is necessary if and as we want and need to build new political movements. But I think there has to be this kind of if we have a utopian vision of the future, we also, I think this is my opinion, we also have to see that there's no common utopia for people, like for everyone. So some people are, this is against some people's interests, what we are trying to do here, which is to, stop climate change. Some people don't give a shit. They want to warm the climate more. And in a sense, I think ahead of us, what is ahead of us is more of a political struggle than some kind of nice slide towards, sustainable utopia.
Yeah.
And this is just what I'm always trying to bring into discussion when we talk about the positive visions, the utopias. They are necessary, but then we also have to see that the work that we have to do to get there might be actually not that utopia. It might be really difficult and even dangerous for many people.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, and especially I really like the idea of no common utopia, and I think the way that like this really impacts my thinking a lot, and like things I've been involved with recently, like in Iceland we've been we had a presidential campaign to make a glacier president, which was really fun, really utopian, and very interesting. But I think it really made me think about, and other people think about, like what is the importance of slowing down climate change? What is it about? Whose interests are we putting at the forefront? And it's very what we called egocentric sometimes too, because it's putting humans at the top, and yes, like ethically it's and yeah, just that's sort of our impulse. And it sounds a little bit weird to say that, like, we shouldn't prioritize the well-being of humans over other creatures or other animals, but essentially what, like, climate change, it's caused by humans, but it's also what changing weather patterns, changing climate systems is just a sort of natural thing, and it will make life better for some other animals. It will, and for other beings, for other creatures, it's also just a change. So, like, for example, with this glacier, it's melting, but it's going to change into water. Like, and what does it feel about becoming water? It's hard to know. Like, there's a lot of indigenous practices, there's a lot of spiritual practices, and people who and research into biosemiotics and things like that say we can get different reactions or different experiences or different responses from these non-living things, or more than humans, that indicate something, one or the other, of or show some sort of positive sign or a negative sign, or communicate some information. But it's still hard to say that, like, yeah, what exactly is this impact going to be? But I don't think that that's an excuse or reason to not want to, you know, not to go against climate or try to reduce the impacts of climate change as an ethical issue. Just to sort of frame the discussion of, I think a lot of times when we do talk about climate response, is that we don't, by focusing on the human, then we don't think about the whole system and how this is human caused and how it requires systems change and a change of how we do things to really do the climate response correctly, to actually incorporate the more than humans, the animals, the ecosystems, to make sure that, you know, it's not just a sort of duct tape, but, you know, something that actually has momentum and changes things going forward. So, like, yeah, I think that really connects with the political movement building thing you're talking about. And yeah, and none of this will be easy, and it will be difficult. Like, when we talk about the campaign with a lot of Icelanders, they're like, that sounds ridiculous, what the fuck, like, you know, it just doesn't make sense to them. So there's a lot of antagonism or just like misunderstandings that we have to deal with along the way, for sure.
And that also forces us, not only the glaciers, but the climate discussion forces us to think of this global neighborhood. You know, it shouldn't be about the people in Iceland thinking that, oh, climate change, great, we can grow more vegetables. Because if it's a bit warmer for them, that means that it's much, like, it's boiling for others. And people just don't make that connection so easily. And yeah, the glacier turning into water, what does that mean for an island, you know? Or for the coast of the UK, like of Scotland, like maybe it will get there, you know?
Interestingly, actually, there's models. I was reading an article by Simone Howe, who's an anthropologist at Rice University, and she focuses a lot on cryospheres. But actually, it's like the melting glaciers in Iceland will most impact the city of Cape Town, South Africa, more than any other place in the world, due to like ocean currents. So like that's definitely a climate justice point for sure.
Yeah, it's literally like expanding our notion of what your neighbor means. It's not like, you know, the person right next door. It's someone like hundreds, thousands of miles away from you. And
almost as far across the world as you can get, you know?
Literally, yeah. And people should confront themselves more often with this thought that what they do really gets to, like, the other side of the world, literally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to comment on that because one of the things that makes me more like very concerned at the moment are some of these social feedbacks that are amplified by climate changes, basically socially, globally, I mean. And one is this, that when societies are confronted with more crises, like food crises, economic crises, typically these kind of protectionist political ideologies raise their head and become more popular. So when you have like the fiscal situation of your state is in a bad shape and people are struggling, they tend to focus more on themselves and like the literal neighbor they have, like next door neighbor. And as the climate warms, we are going to see more and more worse and more frequent crises, which probably means we are going to see more nationalistic, some might say even fascistic political movements. And definitely. countries should like sort of like start to turn more towards themselves and become more protectionist. So this is one thing that I think the political left and political center and the more moderate right should be quite aware of at the moment, and also build their political strategies according to this kind of projection, which I just try to explain.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think is also a component of geoengineering, because some of the criticisms of geoengineering is that it could be used for having more just regional effects or focusing on, cooling one part of the planet, while the negative consequences will then spread to far other parts of the world. So it's definitely, like, I think, yeah, it shows the importance of climate justice and starting this as soon as possible as well. So when it before it gets to the point of too much more, because we've already seen, I think, in Europe and across the world too, of this turn inward and return to nationalism. But before it gets too much further, and before people are only looking after their own interests, but to have these conversations when we're at a hopefully relatively harmonious state where we can actually continue to think about, okay, what impacts is this going to have on some other part of the world, and not just my own country. So it's, again, shows the vitalness of talking about things now, I think.
Yeah, and I guess not just talking, but also doing.
Yeah.
We need to have a global governance framework to regulate these technologies, because as of now, any country can just go ahead and do it, or a private company can do it just for profit, because that's also a component of geoengineering. And so, yeah, what you mentioned of the regional impacts, maybe they would think it would only be, at a regional scale, but surely it wouldn't. And even though Anton mentioned before that we still don't have the technological feasibility or readiness, to really deploy these technologies in a larger scale. I mean, we know how companies work and how governments work. If they want to do something, they might go ahead and just try. And so I guess, sure, we have to talk more and, really burst the bubble and get more people to discuss. But I think we should also be advancing with a more practical conversation, not just what's been happening for the past decades in this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely
because
agreed.
There has been some like testing with, for example, a sort of maybe a lot different form of geoengineering than what we're talking about. But there was a big thing I think a lot of people in this space talk about is when I don't remember his name, the one researcher dumped a bunch of iron filings into the ocean and then had this great algae bloom that had all these consequences. And without like having practical conversations about how we could deploy it, about the governance frameworks, about what it would look like to make, common decisions to say, let's go ahead with this, then we're going to have a lot more instances of that kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, Russ George is the name of
the exactly person.
Yeah, cool. But like when it comes to what Clara said, not just talk, but we should actually do something. On that point, what I find very big sort of thing for myself is try to bring more people from the already existing climate movement into this space, and people who are actually concerned with climate justice and justice in general, but also people from academia, of course, and other sectors of society. But we, like at the moment, it's like a lot of engineers, a lot of atmospheric scientists, and it's some like, I think me and Clara, we probably know personally like all of the NGO people in this space, and that's kind of like quite ridiculous if we think about how big things we are talking about. So we need a lot more people with good mindset and good intents. Yeah,
I think it's a really good point. If you always need, like, I think the way I think about it is like scientists usually, and this is another criticism of geoengineering, is that there might be this lock-on effect where researchers start researching it and then they become so tied up into it, and it's like their project, so they want to see it go through, even if they realize at some point maybe the effects aren't exactly what they intended. And yeah, I think like as a social scientist and becoming interested in geoengineering, this was really the angle that I wanted to come in at, of saying, okay, wait a minute, scientists, like, okay, just talking about deploying geoengineering is one thing, but like, how are we going to do it? What priorities do we have in mind? Which isn't always the immediate question or assumptions that come to scientists, I think, especially when a lot of these scientists are at like, yeah, well-funded places. They're used to, you know, people saying yes to them, and they have, yeah, maybe a certain expectation, or they're used to being treated a certain way where people don't ask them these questions or ask them to maybe slow down and think about other social or cultural connotations of what they're doing, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think no research should be conducted to prove that they can, you know, that they're right. They can be
Yeah.
wrong as well, and then we have to accept that. And so that's why geoengineering also shouldn't be, you know, put in the box of solutions, because it's not a solution. And that's something that we constantly need to make people aware of. Like, we're not talking about a solution, it's just one more potential thing that we acknowledge it might not work, but that just because it might not work, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look into it, because it might work as well. And like Anton also mentioned in the beginning, there are different technologies, and so it's also not about putting all of them in the same box. And then it's really making the distinction between them when it comes to, okay, what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I find it particularly like important to have public funding for the research, just for the reason that you, Clara, talked about. Because if we would have a lot of companies trying to research some of these technologies, they surely would try to prove their investors that this is going to work, and the mindset would be totally wrong. It would not be about scientific. I'm lacking the words in English now, but you know, like trying to figure out all of the questions, but rather the opposite.
Yeah, it's not like a sort of exploratory hypothesis testing. It's okay, we're right. How can we show that we're right, or can make money off of this? Something like that. Yeah. I think that's a really overlooked component sometimes, and when we talk about this. But yeah, I think maybe we should start wrapping up soon. But this has been a really lovely conversation. So yeah, do you guys have, either of you have any concluding comments that you would like to make? Anything else that we haven't quite touched upon that you would like to add?
I hope that more conversations like this, they keep happening in places that we don't expect, and with people who also just heard about this, and then find a way to include this discussion into their already existing field of study or work. Because geoengineering is not only about atmospheric science or, you know, mechanical engineering. It really touches upon all areas of our society, from health, law, you know, you name it, anthropology, even sports. Because like, how can you, you know, go out doing gymnastics if it's 40 degrees Celsius plus? You just can't. So there's room for everyone in this discussion, and I think that's what should be made clear, and especially for climate activists who still don't see themselves as part of this discussion. I really, really hope that they see how valuable they are, especially people who have a more radical thinking and that want to change things. We need those people in this field with us as well, so that it's just not, you know, a couple of voices trying to scream in in this huge sea of scientists.
Yeah, I really like the gymnastics example you used, because it is like this climate change and environmental change is going to affect all of our passions. So meeting people in their passions and then demonstrating, okay, this is going to change the way that you do something you really care about, and then the knowledge you bring from this passion or this thing is very valuable, and it is part of the discussion of how we want to frame the societies we create in the future, and that's part of the geoengineering conversation, for sure. So I think that's a great point. Yeah,
Absolutely. One person even gave this quite interesting perspective that if stratospheric aerosol injection would happen, that would also change how we view colors in this world, because that would like change how the sunlight is scattered in the atmosphere. So we would probably have less contrasts in our visual field, and how that relates to visual arts and how we experience the world. I don't know. It's just so amazingly vast topic, and
yeah,
all of these
wow.
angles, which
That's something
Clara
I've
brought
never
up.
thought about.
Yeah, that's quite interesting actually. Maybe my concluding point would be that I had a point. What was it?
Publicly fund geoengineering research now.
Hmm?
Is that your
Yeah,
point?
yeah.
Publicly fund geoengineering research now.
It is, and everybody on board, because I think realistically speaking, this topic is just going to grow. The climate impacts are getting worse. Some of the ice sheets are on a brink of tipping point, on a brink of collapsing. People are going to realize this more and more in the coming years. The research is going forward. So just as we talked about, even if you are skeptical or you don't like this idea, I don't like this. I would rather study, I don't know, Latin books at university, but I have to be here because this is important space. So everybody please on board. And one interesting point about youth is actually that I was just, my little brother showed me the geographic textbook from high school, the first geography class, which is the class that everybody in high school has to take. And I think it was something like page 20. So in the very beginning, there was a full page about geoengineering.
Wow.
Whoa.
So kids, 15-year-old kids in high school are already reading about marine cloud brightening, stratospheric aerosol injection. And that was quite neutral, the whole explanation there, which I think is good. But if you, Clara, said let's hope that kids won't have to bother themselves with this, at least high school kids have to gonna
No, I
in
think
Finland.
high school is a good beginning. I'm working with high school students as well.
That's
so
good.
I think that's when it should start. But I just wanted to add one more thing when it comes to research funded by governments. Even though I agree with that, I also think there should be some scrutiny of which governments are funding that, and do governments have an equal access to funding research? Because the UK, the US, Canada, they might have, the potential to do so, but other countries might not have it. And so how do you ensure that, again, we're all on board, and that the research won't just be benefiting the interest of a nation that just wants to maintain the status quo?
What?
And
The US would never do that. Are you kidding?
And Anton, I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think we should also be clear on that point. Because, for example, the Israeli Ministry of Defense is putting money into a private company that's looking into geoengineering.
Right.
And then also, how do you navigate that with already existing geopolitical tensions and all that? So it's not yes, we want research funded by government so that you also have, you know, so that you also legitimize the research in a way.
And have accountability and
Yeah. And so I guess the more global it becomes, the better. So that it's not, again, only a research for your own borders and you're still like in this mindset of, you know, my country, your country. And yeah, I truly hope we get past this idea because borders are just a fake construct.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe in the future we can have another conversation about the UN and the UNFCCC and UNEP and COP and all those mechanisms. But because I think, yeah, there's a lot of interesting possibilities, but also frustrations there for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Agreed, Clara. Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. Absolutely.
Yeah, because there's already a lot of criticism that falls in our lap, so I wouldn't want one more.
Yeah, we're not promoting the U.S. government or the U.S. military being the only ones pouring money into this because, oh God, that usually doesn't end well.
Yeah, you're the one to say it coming from there, so good.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah, anyway, thanks both of you, Anton and Clara, for joining me. It's been a really, really lovely discussion. And I hope everyone listening really enjoyed it as much as I did. And I look forward to keeping this conversation going with you guys in different forums. And I'm sure we'll see each other around at different places.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Clara. And thanks, Cody. And thanks, Cody, for making this happen.